Hello, good morning, and welcome back to Reaper Pro Tips with me, your host, Anne, and Disembodied Hands, Quindy, Justin, and John. Sorry for the lateness this morning, guys. It was that kind of morning. It's one of those mornings. Problematic morning. But it'll get better, right? It'll get better. Yay. Too late to have a good day. Or a good week. Oh, noes. That's too bad, Kurtigo. I'm sorry. I at least hope that the week will get better than today. Here we are with Darius. What are we going to do today? Let's paint a little tiny rat and work on some blue. Try to knock out this blue, the texture on the blue. Let's do that. That sounds fun. I think I used wolf gray on the rat, but I'm going to go to using... where are my... There's my walnut brown. I'm going to start using walnut with a bit of cream in it, I think, for my typical wolfy gray organic colors. It's what I use for gray things in the wild. Gray things usually actually aren't gray. They're a mixture of cream and black hair. So we're going to use a mixture of cream and black paint. Or near black anyway. We're going to use walnut because it has brown in it. It'll shift it a little farther toward a warm gray. So I'm going to get that in my palette. How was your weekend, guys? Where is my... What do I want? I want creamy ivory. That's my other favorite one to use for wolfy colors. This rat is going to be very wolfy. But rats, I mean, when they're gray rats, they tend to have that organic kind of salt and pepper look. So, plus a creamy belly. So we'll give him a creamy belly if we have enough room. Hopefully we will. So I'm going to just set up straight up walnut and creamy ivory, and then I'm going to make a mix. And because I know that walnut packs a heck of a punch, I'm going to do my mix with 4 drops of this and only 1 drop of walnut. And it's going to be shockingly, like, dark. Yours is good? We had an actual paint club yesterday. We had one person because the Omicron concerns meant that some people stayed away and one person had a sore throat and decided to stay home, but it turned out just to be a cold, not to be Omicron. But at least one person showed up, so we had a painting session, which was nice. It was nice to have a paint club again. So hopefully in a couple of weeks things will have calmed down a little bit and we'll get more people. This person drove from actually quite a long way away too, so it was like, cool. So we might actually pull people from a couple hours away for our paint club in Mountain View, which is nice. Makes me happy. It's a long drive, so hopefully they think it's worth it. Espresso, not coffee. Coffee, espresso. Crowley, that was a pretty weak coffee. Shadow Raven did a better coffee at the beginning, I saw. There was a giant all caps coffee worthy of a Crowley. But so if you are like not feeling it today, or you're feeling like even coffee is not, is not working, you can endorse Shadow Raven as your coffee screamer in the meantime. He's doing a fine job. All right, I'm going to put an extra drop of water into each of these. Espresso is small but mighty. This is true. I have to have it with a lot of coconut milk, or it will upset my gut, along with everything else on the planet. Well, okay, not everything, but you know, feels like that today. Been a long year all week. Yeah. I don't know. 2022 has just been a little bit frustrating so far. Just a little. It'll get better, it says. It'll get better. Trust me, it says. So, one thing you may notice when you mix walnut, and this is kind of why I'm using a yellowish off-white here to mix with it. But if you just mix pure white with walnut, you may notice it has a slight purple shift. And the reason that it does that is that it's got a mixture of red oxides and blacks. And when you mix red oxide with black, or any red with black, you tend to get... If there's no white involved, then you'll get a brown. If you're not using red oxide, or you're just using a regular red, you're going to get a purple. That's kind of the way that coal black works with various reds. So in here, because there's white added, instead of a very rich brown, you see that purple shift more when you just add a white. But if you add a white with yellow in it, then you're shifting that purple a little more neutral. So that's why I used creamy ivory with this. The old walnut, the pro paint walnut, was even more striking because the black base that we had for pro paints was even more blue. So you'd get a definite purple if you mixed white with the old walnut. I used it on a mini, I remember, back in the beginning of Warlord. So yeah. The only thing about slipping and falling is you just got to get back up. I've been fighting with my book rewrite that I'm working on, so I get it. I was all gung-ho until I realized, oh no, there's more problems here than I remember. It's like when you think you're close to the end of a mini, and then you really start looking at it, and you're like, oh, there are more problems here than I remember. And you go, That's kind of it. The same thing when you're a writer. It's the same thing. So it's funny because I use a 100-day goal journal, and it tracks me every day. I mark like how focused I was, like how on track I was, and how I feel kind of about it. And I was like boop 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 all last week. Every 10 days it has you do a summary of your chart just for elucidation. It's a cool journal. I like it a lot. I'm going to buy another one when I'm done with this 100 days. Good morning, Lady Nim. And thank you for the resub. 6 months. It's a half a subiversary. Cute. Thank you. Do you understand now, Crowley? Oh, hold on. There's relatively little, I talk about this stuff. Let's see here, Chapman. Okay. It's years of experience. There's really only a few shifts you need to be aware of, Chapman, and most of them are involving the color black, which is why I say when you're mixing paints, when you're trying to experiment with mixing colors, don't use a color that has a lot of black in it. If you're using a dark, try to use a saturated dark that does not contain black. For instance, the one that I like is 9239 Monarch Purple, for example, if you're trying to find a dark purple to use in mixes, but you don't want any black in it, the darkness in 9239 is entirely due to the pigments of the blue pigment specifically. So it won't have any black interactions. Most interactions that are weird come from mixing that coal black pigment in. Does that make sense to you? So if you want to avoid some of that weird stuff, that's what you do. The only other chemical interaction or color interaction that can be kind of problematic and very counterintuitive is that certain magentas mixed with certain greens will go bluish. But that's such a weak reaction that unless you're directly mixing those two colors, you won't even see it. You might just notice that if you try to mix a little green into like a gray that you've mixed purple into, it'll go bluish or cold, but it's like I said, it's a very weak reaction and you have to hit it precisely. So most people don't even ever notice it. But the most problematic interactions come with black, with the addition of black. Black will make your skin tones go ashy. Black will make your yellows go green. Black will make your reds go purple. It's just, that's why I don't know, because obviously I can't ask them, but a lot of the old masters just didn't use black. They just mixed colors to get saturated darks. Part of that was that they wanted a more interesting color than black. Black is very dead. When the eye looks at it, it tends to make the eye just sheer away from it because there's nothing interesting about it. It's just like a total absence. But the other reason I think is those interactions, is that you can lose a lot of saturation and you can get some weird color shifts if you're using actual black. Does that make sense? So when you're mixing colors, just when you're trying to learn, especially as a new person, try to avoid black or just use black as itself for a color. I don't even do that. I tend to use liners. I tend to use blue liner and do that. There are occasions where I will reach for pure black, but they are pretty rare. Yeah, so all of this weird stuff, yeah, that you see. And Walnut has a huge, I mean, you can tell when a paint has black in it. If it's that dark, and I haven't explicitly called it out as not having black, like I did with Monarch Purple, it's got black in it. Liners have black, Walnut has black, Black and Brown has black. You know, most dark paints are going to have some black. There'll be a varying load as to what it's got. Yeah, Nightmare Black is a little bit different because Nightmare Black is a heavy front load of blue, so it actually acts more like a blue and less like a black. Much more like a blue. Oh no. Hello, hello. Yeah, okay, cool. Just checking to make sure. Well, Heraldic Red is just useful, so that's good. You have a red skull now. Nice. Hello, Bob and Julie. I missed you. I miss seeing you come into the chat, rather. All right. But yeah, so most problematic interactions are going to come from the usage of black and mixing of black with other things. I personally feel that if you're going to use pure black on a model, use it as a base coat for a thing that you want to be actually black, but then reach for a totally different color to highlight it with. Usually I use blue grays. Let me get this guy in focus here. So I'll use blue liner and add white, or I'll, mix a blue gray in, or I'll use a brownish gray, something like that. Yeah, that is the problem with, hello Art Drip, nice to meet you. That is the problem with the Reaper promo colors that go out in the goodie bags, is that I'm reading chat and trying to talk at the same time, is that you tend to get a lot of them. So now is your chance to gift Ginger Cookie to many people. Lord nobody. This is a Bones USA figure, Cajun. And so it's fairly inexpensive because it's Bones. It is a Reaper model. It is the second Bones USA that we ever did. So Darius the Blue and 30,002. Sculpted by Bobby Jackson. Ron loves pointy hat wizards, and so Reaper has way too many pointy hat wizards, in my opinion. Ginger Cookie is a good color for things like a base coat for parchment, especially, actually. It can also be used as kind of a shadow for really warm whites, like when you're going with linen, but you're really going kind of warm and creamy with it. So let's do some tiny little fur on the back of this guy. Maybe I'm a little too thin there. I don't think I'm too thin, though. Hold on. Maybe I've just matched the color too closely. Yeah, I'm not too thin. I can get a nice little thin fur mark here. So maybe my gray is darker than I thought. This can happen. In which case I may need a little bit more. Yeah, I think my gray here is just darker than I was expecting on this mouse. I thought I used wolf gray, but maybe I actually used a mix. Actually, I think. But yeah, Ginger Cookie is one of those colors that's very good, I find, for like old parchment, old books like this, a good base coat for it. Good for highlighting kind of beigey browns. I'm going to grab a brush full of walnut. I'm going to actually darken down my gray. I don't really want to use like straight up walnut on this. But I do need to get it to where I can see the fur strokes. So a little bit more and then a little bit more. The problem really is that his eyebrows go over the top of his hat, so you almost are cutting him off right at the eyes, which could be really hard to fix, I think. You could cut him off at the brim and then shave this, but it's not quite the right, location. Like, this is okay for the back of his skull, but this, I don't know about this. It's hard call. It's a little bit, I would say this is difficult. It depends on your facility with green stuff, though. like, if you're good with green stuff, Shadow Raven, I think you could probably do it. Because then you just cut him off right through the, like, you just slice here and you'd come out kind of over here, and then you'd carve out that little divot between the eyeballs. Then you'd have to sculpt the head and figure out, you know, how you're going to do the hair. But I mean, it wouldn't be terribly bad if you can actually do a bit of sculpting. If you are brand new and have never used green stuff before, or have hardly ever used green stuff, I would say difficult. Hello, M. Barton. Nice to meet you. Alrighty. I'm going to grab my gray again and see if I can actually get some fur texture on the back of Mousy here. I'm seeing it a little bit now. It's very subtle, though. That's okay, though. I'm okay with subtle. I can bring in some actual walnut after I've got this initial layer down. And bring in even more texture. I just want the start of a darker back on him. Boop. Let's see. Kind of like that. Little tiny brush strokes. Let's actually bring in some walnut. I'll show you. It'll be easier to see. So little tiny brush strokes. And then if I put the walnut down and it's too dark, I can actually go over it with the previous gray. So this is kind of the reverse of how my new 28mm texture video is going to tackle it. Which is kind of why I thought I would do it. In that video, which is going to hopefully come out today, I've got to finish. I had to reshoot it, and so I'm finishing editing. But it's Patreon, so that will be patreon.com/paintingbig. It's my $2 tier. But I start more dark and go light with that tutorial, and it's just the opposite if you want to do something like this and add darker fur to a lighter model. But so I thought I would do the reverse of the dark to light method on this. This is specifically, though, when you use the dark fur over light fur method, you are specifically adding a pattern. That's why you would do it. It's not so much texture, although it does have the effect of adding some of that. Now I'm going over this with the dark gray to make these little walnut dashes blend in a little more. I want kind of that salt and pepper subtle effect that wild animals get. Like so. Hey, Raggy Pants. Nice to meet you. Or nice to see you, if I know you already. I was just talking about that at Paint Club. When it's like, I'm like, have I met you before? And our attendee was like, you have very briefly at ReaperCon. I'm like, oh, along with 500 other people. Got it. Nice to really meet you. So if I have seen you before on stream, then re-hi. And if, to use the old school parlance, and if I have not met you before, then welcome. We are doing some little dark fur texture on the back of Mr. Ratty. And of course, you guys are seeing it hugely blown up. In reality, you know how tiny this is. But really, it's just little, like, dashes. Tiny dashes. Oh, okay. Well, then, hi. And I know your real name. Way to show up. You actually had time because you work from home. So yeah, cool. It's cool to see you. Yes, this is what I do for my mornings. So it really is a re-hi. Awesome. So just like, you're kind of just trying to get that pattern on there more than highlighting. You want to get that just suggestion. It still does create texture, just not quite the same way as doing a highlighted texture. And fur can go either way, and sometimes it goes both ways on the same animal. Actually, let me get you guys a reference photo. Hold on. I have a poster on my writing desk that exemplifies this. Hold on. Here is Disapproving Coyote. This is Disapproving Coyote. Disapproving Coyote glares at me when I ought to be writing to motivate me to write. Now, I'll put his fur underneath this real quick. But he is a great example of how you would take a dark ground color and bring up light fur. But he's also got the opposite going on over here. He's got some dark sabling. If you look, it's hard to see, but the ends of some of these hairs start to go black. You can especially see it on the side here. You can see that black. So all on his back, he's actually got light fur going into dark fur. And on his face and chest, he's got a dark underground, and then he's got light fur going out. So, yes, I love Disapproving. Disapproving Coyote is my favorite coyote. And he's a great writing motivator. He just gives you that stink eye, and you're like, all right, I know I should be working. So this is an example. You can also see the dark ticking here. See on the ears? So that's like what we're trying to do on Mr. Mouse. And usually you're going to see that dark sabling on the back of animals. If you look at sable dogs, you'll see it also, as that tends to be a lot darker on the back. And then when you get toward the front of the animal, where it tends to be lighter on the underside, that's where you're more likely to see the shadows coming up with lighter highlights. So it depends on the animal, and it depends on the individual, and it depends on the species. But in general, those are the two different ways that you can highlight fur on an animal. So we are doing the dark on the back here. We'll put back Disapproving Coyote, because we're working, darn it. He can't give us the stink eye right now. Paint every day, yes. Yes, that is an entrance worthy of respect. This is true. So that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to get that little bit of texture on the back. And we can certainly use this as shading, right? So as the back curves around underneath, we can darken it down here so that it also just kind of goes into a shadow, or emphasizes the shadow. Oh, I got a little bit too rough there. Remember that the key to doing fine brush strokes like this, oh, sorry, I went off camera. That's the problem with zooming in this much, is this like, gotta stay right in the center of the camera. But remember, the key to doing these tiny little brush strokes is you've got to have a good brush with a good point. Really, really fine point is a necessity, just so that the hairs will come off super fine. And you've got to make sure that you've got a little bit of, your paint's got to be a bit thinned, and how much you thin it's up to you. But here I'm probably at 2-to-1. I think for me the minimum is probably 3-to-1, but that's going to make a very strong line depending on the color you're working with. So you need to thin it at least a little for it to come off the brush better. And then you also need to unload your brush. Don't leave a ton of paint on your brush. If you do, you're going to get big blobs. You're not going to get these fine little lines. So now I'm bringing my gray back in to blend in. That you can see how I got a little heavier on the dark fur there, but it also serves to keep our texture and create a shadow. So now we gotta do the other side of the disapproving rat. Or mouse. I think he's a rat. Ratsy. And you can see that that Bobby is sculpted just a little bit of fur texture here on here. In fact, there's a little bit of a flaw there. Let me see if I can... Is that like really... It's showing up more on camera than it is. It is actually a lock of fur. So I'll leave it. We'll just highlight it. It'll probably disappear once we blend it in. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's a feature and what's a problem. Hey, Trashorama, 30 months, dang. No, it just rubbed off because I tend to hold stuff. When you've got a top of or any part of a model that's this pointy, it's gonna probably rub off. So, Fuzzy Bee, it's really just a matter of patience. So, if you're unloading your brush, I use a well palette. If you use a wet palette, then probably you want to unload your brush on maybe even a piece of paper. Like I've used even sticky notes before. You just need to get the paint off the brush, and you don't want to use something like a paper towel because that's got microfibers and you may pick those up. But I mean, just don't dip a lot of your brush in there. And depending on the thinness of your paint and the size of your brush, you need to dab it off. I'm also rotating the brush as I dab so that I'm forming the point into what I need. So if I rotate the brush with my hands as I dab it off, it's going to dab off all sides. And then I can do tiny little controlled lines with no puddles and no nothing. The bigger the brush you use, the longer it will take you to unload it. The runnier your paint, the longer it will take to unload it, which is why I advise people who are just starting out trying to do this and to learn it to use a smaller brush. It helped me when I was learning. So if I'm using really, really thin paint, like a white, because white you can thin quite a bit and still have it be opaque, I will use tiny brush here. So here's the brush I was using, and there's tiny brush for comparison. Tiny brush is about as small as I'll ever use. It's a triple aught Da Vinci Maestro Series 10, which is their normal round. The Reaper Aught 10 from their black-handled Kolinsky Sable line is about this size. So I don't use anything smaller, but if you use something little like this, the advantage is that you don't have to unload it much, even if you're using really thin paint, because it's such a tiny brush. It only needs a few dabs to come and unload to the point where you can use it in a controlled manner. There we go. Back to Ratty. How many times can you sub this one? Yeah, I thought you had just resubbed. So hopefully that makes sense, Fuzzy Bee. But yeah, that's the key really to getting control of your paint. If you tend to put paint on a model and it flows everywhere, or it makes puddles and it like totally seems to defy you, especially if your paint is a little thinner, then try to unload. I like the well palette because it's easy for me to unload, but you can find a way to do it with a wet palette too. A lot of people I know will use like a sheet of printer paper. Like I said, when I use a wet palette, I have used sticky notes. I tend to like paper because it's not very fibrous. Like a paper towel is I think it's gonna totally get hairs in your paint. I'm not sure if Rhonda uses, I know to point her brush, she uses a damp sponge. Technically you could do that to unload your brush as well. Although then you'd have to rinse a lot of paint out of your sponge. So we're starting again with that kind of slightly darker gray to start our texture. I'm just building it up kind of gently in layers. And the reason I'm doing it this way is both to kind of map it out. So I kind of have okay, yeah, that's how far I want this to go. That's where I want this to be before I start loading it on and committing. But it's also just that I find with animals that successive layers of fur texture give you a more natural look, a more realistic look. So, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Watercolor paper is what I use to keep my notes on what colors I'm using and stuff. I use the little artist trading cards because then I can put them in a binder. Watercolor paper is really useful that way. So good on you for using it. And not too expensive. If you buy it in big pads, you have a lot of room. Lint-free paper towels would also work, sorry. It's a Monday. Forgive me for my lack of English. So we'll just keep building up our dark gray a little bit. I don't want it to totally cover the undercoat though. I'm going to come back in with my walnut and there, that we've got a good start. You can see that starts to make him look fuzzy, and then when you get more of a color over here, you can really see. And now what doing the dark sabling does is it does tend to make the pattern look a little more harsh, and that's because there's such a difference between that dark and the midtone. All right, little rat, we're going to grab some walnut, and this walnut's probably thinned about 2 to 1. So it makes a very fine, but a darker line. So essentially how much you thin your paint isn't just like how easily it's going to come off your brush. You can see how fine those strokes are. And this is a good test if you do use a well palette. And if you're a beginning painter, I advise you to try both. I advise you to work with a wet palette and a well palette. Figure out what each is good for and figure out which one suits your style. I'm almost exclusively a well palette user. I do use a wet palette every once in a while just to switch it up and make myself do things a little differently. Also to become better at it. But I like control. I like being able to thin the paint to where I can do exactly what I need to do. But if you do have a well, you can do little test strokes on the side of it like this. Otherwise, you could do them on paper. You could do them on whatever you want. but I'll do that on occasion just to make sure that I've got my paint exactly where I want it. The more you thin it, obviously the lighter the color, as it'll be more transparent. This is a little bit, this is thin enough to be slightly transparent. These lines are not nearly as dark as actual walnut. Oh, we got to get back in focus now, especially for this. There we are. Yeah, palette cam. It's different for everybody, Cajun. Figure out first of all, I should ask yourself, why are you swatching it? If it's to like compare different colors, like say you just want a record of every swatch, then it makes sense maybe to do it in the order that your paint is organized. But if you want to do things like compare different reds, for example, if you want to be able to easily put those swatches next to each other, then you probably want to organize your swatches in a way that you can, move them next to each other and sort them that way. So first ask yourself why you want to swatch, and then kind of figure out what the best way to organize a swatch thing will be, and that will tell you how to do your swatches. So like if you wanted all your reds next to each other and you wanted room for notes, then maybe you would use the artist trading card thing like I do, because you could put those into a card binder just like for magic cards or baseball cards, and you can swap them so that you can put different colors together. You could arrange color schemes that way. There's various things. You might also just use an app like Paint Rack. If you tend to go to your phone for those things and that you don't feel like you need an actual real world sample. I personally, as an artist, probably because I started out as a 2D artist, I really like having the actual physical thing swatched in front of me. I don't like digital swatches. I don't know, I can't get my hands dirty that way. Like, I feel like I like to see it actually on a surface. So for me, the Paint Rack app and its friends don't work so great, but for many people, they're really, really useful, especially for keeping track of color schemes. So there's all sorts of options, and what you'll gravitate toward is just, function of your style of painting and how you interact with the hobby. There is no one right answer. There are so many options. It's because his familiar is a rat. And the reason we decided to do this is because I also bought the Christmas model of the dragon cat in the Christmas tree. So the idea is to also paint the dragon cat in the Christmas tree and to put him over here so that the rat is actually glaring at the cat in the tree and the wizard is trying to expel the cat. That is the actual story. However, we only have one model right now, and I'm probably not going to paint the dragon cat in the tree until next holiday season. So that means this one won't be going to Ron. He'll be sticking around until I can finish his friend. So I'll have to keep that in mind as we get closer to the holiday season. That'll have to be one of the models we start, like in October maybe, so that we can finish it by, December or January. Although it probably, honestly, won't take that long because the tree will be fast and the dragon cat will be the most fun. So, all right, Ratty. He's got a nice dark back to him now. Let's see here. But I'm happy that you could actually read my book. So I need to tackle the top of his head a little bit better. It's a little bit dicey. And then I need to come back and I need to start putting some highlights on other parts of his fur and around his eyes. Putting some light kind of spectacle highlights. Not only is it something that a lot of animals have around their eyes, but it can help to set off eyes that are very dark like Ratty's. So let's just get a few more. I gotta make sure to stay on camera. This is the biggest challenge of zooming in so much when you're doing such tiny little things. And I'm gonna paint the back of Ratty's ears dark as well, because that's something that most sabled animals have, is slightly darker color on the back of their ears. Or at least a lot of them do. So I'm kind of using a mix of my gray and my walnut to get a dark but not black gray for the back of Ratty's ears. There we go. This is a tiny little animal, but I do love painting animals, so this is like totally in my wheelhouse. Even if this guy's a little cartoony, he's still fun. Yeah, because lightening the color with white will kind of show you what pigments might be in it in the case of a mix, like with many paints are a mix of multiple pigments. And when you thin with white, you can either thin with white or use water. If you're using watercolor cards, you can totally just use water to stretch it out over the white paper. But adding white otherwise, especially for dark colors, you'll see very quickly if the green that you have is a bluish green or a yellowish green or what. I'm going to darken also the bridge of his nose. Such a tiny nose. It's so tiny. So we're going to kind of go slow. You kind of go slow, you put a little initial line down to be your marker, and then you just kind of fill in very gently. Now connect it up with the rest of the dark on the head. So it's kind of a little arrowhead shape. And I think I'm going to accentuate his little eyebrows. There we go. I like him. All right. Now I'm going to shade. I'm just going to use this color to do a general shadow under his jaw there. And bring up a little bit of a shadow under the ears. A little bit of a shadow here under the arm. I want these arms to get a little bit darker. Good there. Good there. We're getting there. He needs a little light belly though. We'll get there. I want to accentuate shadows on this side. It's so tiny, you don't want to spend a lot of time on your rat. But because I like to paint animals so much, I like to kind of make them look as good as they can. There. And I got a little bit of a blurf there, so I can clean that up. I'm going to take my creamy ivory and give him a kind of a lighter area around his mouth and on his belly. Oh, the decorations, huh? Yeah, our entire block, like just the block that we are on in our neighborhood, everybody's just doubled down on keeping their holiday lights up. We took our colored ones down, but our fringe around our roof is white. It's a cold white, so it's very wintry. So we haven't taken it down yet. And some neighbors have not taken down like all the decorations are still up. Doo-doo-doo. Your cat would have acted like you were killing her if you tried to put wings on her. Otherwise, Julie would be so there. My old cat would have tolerated it, but he would have looked at me like, why? So I'm going to just kind of use this cream color. Again, it's really, really gentle, small brush strokes. And I'm going to thin this quite a bit, actually. I started out, because this is mostly made with white, and it isn't a white base, which means that it's got a very high front load of white as well. And this is, to remind you, this is Creamy Ivory 9144. It's a great neutral cream color for when you're doing warm whites. And also a great color for like animals, for the white portions of animals, which usually aren't very white. They're actually a cream, usually a light cream color. So this is cool, and it covered up my little blurf on the mouth, but it's too thick for me to do really, to layer it. So I'm going to throw a couple of brushfuls of water into it. So this is why I like the Well palette, because I can get my paint tuned to exactly what I need it to do. And then it'll stay there. It'll stay that way because its surface area is for evaporation is smaller than the overall, like because the depth of the well gives less surface area to evaporation area, and so it keeps your paint good, usually for at least an hour. I usually don't have to thin until I'm an hour into the stream once I've tuned it. So let's get in there, and I'm just gonna see. Yeah, that's good. But because there's so much white in this color, I'm going to get his lower jaw, see if I can kind of exaggerate that. Yeah, there we go. We've got kind of a little lower jaw there. He's so tiny. There he is. There's his expression. Definitely disapproving ratty. Disapproving familiar. Wizard incompetent. Why did he buy the cat in the first place? He thought it was going to be a good idea for some reason. But yeah, white is a very opaque pigment. It is the highest pigment grind. It's the largest pigment size. As far as when you grind the pigment down, every pigment has a particulate size that it goes to. And the size of the pigment grind is going to determine the coverage. So it's very intuitive, that part of paint chem. So essentially, if your color covers really well, that means that its particle size is probably pretty good. You can also alter or influence. Yeah, I may want the ears dark in general. I think I want the ears dark around the edges. Let's just do that. So the other thing that influences coverage is the base that is used. And by the base, I mean the goop that the pigments go into, the water-based goop. The water-based goop has resins in it, and those resins also have particle sizes, and they will determine your coverage along with your pigments. I personally feel like that it's much less base, though. Then, of course, there's also thickening agents. If you add a thickening agent, you will get higher coverage at the expense of not being as good to thin. There we go. Yeah, I like the dark. The dark rim around the ears is great because it makes the ears actually stand out a bit there. And his face is lighter. I'm going to make his little arms lighter and his belly lighter. And good afternoon, Chrithognis. But yeah, so because white has such a high size, a high pigment grind as we call it, about 0.9 microns. Keep in mind that 1 micron is a measurement of when you can actually see a thing. So that means that if you have, sometimes I've heard people say in the past, oh, the pigment is not fine enough in your paint because I can see grit. They're completely off base there. Just to totally throw that little paint myth into the trash can and stomp on it a little bit. No modern day pigments, unless you're making your own paint from coarsely ground solid pigments. No modern day pigments that you're going to find in any quality paint line are going to be bigger than a micron. That's not what that grit is. Chances are the grit is coming from an additive of some sort, most likely the matting agent that's being used. So it's not the pigment. Trust me on this one. I have the specs on all the pigments that Reaper uses, and white is the largest grind size at 0.9, and that's still too small for you to see with your naked eye, or with even rather larger magnification. You'd have to have pretty extreme magnification. And most pigments are much smaller. How you choose to interpret my words is up to you, Demetzik. All right, so I'm essentially using this white to start bringing in some light color here. I'm still keeping my gray, and I'm still using the same brush stroke as far as what I was using to suggest the texture of the fur, so that it blends in a bit. But it lets me put a bit of highlight on. I can also use this cream color to kind of highlight the pink, so it's hard to see on camera. The pink on the fleshy parts of him. I can bring it in and use it to highlight his little toes, for example. Because it's a creamy color is an okay color to use to highlight an organic pink like this, a pink that already has skin tone in it. I'm not going to go whole hog on that. I don't want to cover up my pink, but I do want some highlights. All right, so you can see his chest is covered by his paws, but his little lower belly is showing. So we'll just use some little brush strokes there. And that's really hard to see. Yeah, you can see it. There you go. I need to get the right depth. When you're this zoomed in and this at this focus, your focal length is very precise. You have to get really close, but you guys can see that I'm doing the fur brush strokes pretty much top to bottom, which is how the fur would be growing, kind of front to back on the rat. And I'm going to leave a shadow on the interior of the legs here so that you can see that that's the belly and it's different from the legs. With something so small, sometimes you have to overemphasize that. I encourage the use of violence in, like, toward ideas that are wrong. I encourage the use of violence in debunking paint chemistry myths. I don't know. I'm not really a violent person. All right. So there we go. So we've got a nice little creamy belly now. We've got our little haunches. We can actually see them. Now we got to get this side of the face and block in the ear. And then I'm going to try to put just a little highlight in the eye. These eyes are too tiny to do much more than just paint them a dark color, which is what most rats would have. If we had a white rat, we'd paint them red. But doing a little highlight would be good. So yeah. So to actually come back to my point, which is so hard to do on Twitch, it's so easy to get distracted. Because white has a high pigment grind, it has a high coverage, and that means you have to thin it more if you want it to be kind of transparent to make it give you fur texture without being like really, really like just like big white lines. The answer there is to use an off-white first, which I'm doing, and also to thin your paint to a point where you can get a nice smooth, you know, not stark highlight. Like if I was using this full strength, you would see every freaking line. But because I've thinned it, I can almost blend it just a little bit and it'll look a lot more natural. Now, where you would want to keep your colors more stark is if you were painting something like a husky dog and you wanted those really bright white face markings, then you might keep it a little stronger. I've done a video on that for my Patreon. I don't know if did we link my Patreon earlier? If we did, we can not link to it now, but patreon.com/paintingbig. I do a lot of content on that Patreon per month. Especially if you're at a higher level, you get all of the under tiers, the lower tiers content as well. Let's get this little face figured out here. Now this is where we have to stop doing a little bit of the texture. If I want that mouth to stand out, I'm pretty much going to have to line around it, but with a light color. Because I've got the frowny line there. But if I put too much texture around it, it's going to kind of obscure that line. So I need to bring in more of a linear outline to the mouth, not so much a fur texture, so that the ratty expression shows up. There's ratty. So I solidified that line a little bit. I kept a little bit more texture out here because his poofy cheeks are going to have more texture anyway. And you know, this is stuff that isn't going to show up on the average person looking at your model, but it'll probably show up a little bit on camera if you take photos of the model. So, and that's a little bit too harsh. Now my belly doesn't look light enough. So let's just do a little bit heavier brush stroke here. So if I don't thin my paint quite so much, or if I leave a little bit more of it on my brush, I can get a little lighter pattern here. And these just learning to do this, learning that if you want a lighter color, it isn't always about mixing one. It's sometimes about how much you thin your paint or don't. That's just with practice, just mucking about with the paint, painting models. You get a feel for it. Thanks. Yeah, it doesn't show up until I get really close on the camera because the only problem is that this camera does, if you've got things that are off-white and they're different off-whites, they sometimes blend in. So it's hard to see the wizard's rosy nose from far away. I'm going to grab some of this gray and I'm going to actually put a bit of a fur texture over on the face here. It's a little stark for me. Could also glaze it. But again, building up various fur texture layers does help to make a creature look more organic. So that's, yeah, it's a little bit toned down. I like that a little better. I'm going to bring this cream up, though, right on the edge of his little cheeks. And I'm going to get his ear marked in. Since we decided a darker rim looked better, or at least I did. makes it stand out just a little bit more and kind of defines that shape. There. Excellent. Can I get that tip up there? Now we have a cute little rat. Boy, do we have a cute little rat. It's adorable, actually. Here, I'm going to get his little, try to get a highlight in those tiny little eyes. I'm going to go over them with walnut first to make sure they're really dark. And then I'll try to get a highlight in there. I'll have to get out my pure white for that because this is so small. So first, we're going to block in the eye a little darker. Really dark. That's going to make a tiny white highlight show up a little more. And rats and creatures do tend to have dark eyes. Most animals have darker eyes. Not always. Obviously, birds can be very different. And if it's a white rat, it would have red eyes. But I totally didn't get the mouth very good on that side. So there we go. Better mouth. All right, let's mix up some pure white. I like this guy. I need to highlight his tail and shade his tail a bit. But he's really cute. He's really cute. We like Rat. Rat is adorable. And now he's not just a gray blob, which is great. All right, so hold on. Ratty, sit there for a second. Let's get our pure white out. I'm going to keep this a little stronger. For pure white, even 2:1 is really strong, paint to water. Because it's our highest pigmented white in Master Series. So it's got a lot of white pigment, a lot of white pigment in it. Almost overload the paint white pigment. Because there is a break point, if you didn't know that. When you are creating paint, you find out that there is a certain pigment load that will actually break your paint. And this is because pigments normally don't set or dry. They rely on the resin in the paint to do that. So if you just worked with pigment, every time you added water, the pigment would just come up. It might stain the paper or the primer underneath if it's a staining color, but you'd be able to scrub it up. We don't want that on models. So you have to watch the balance of your pigment and your base. Because some bases, if you put too much pigment in them, what you'll notice is the paint will indeed come up when you add water or a wet layer over the top of it. Like it won't have any adhesion. At the very least, you will damage adhesion. And this is why when you use tube paint, if you're thinning down tube paint a lot, it's not meant to do that. It's very easy to end up making the paint very fragile that way because it's not really meant to be put on in a certain like thinness of layers. So if you're using tube paint, you very much may find that you need to seal over the top of it in order to keep it from getting hurt, essentially, from rubbing off or scraping off, or just generally it's not going to be as durable. All right, let's see here. This, I may have thinned too much. Did I thin too much? We'll find out. So I did 2:1. And I guess my test would be to kind of go down here on the base and see if I can see how bright my white dot is. Oh, my white dot's pretty bright. Yeah, that's pretty bright. All right, we'll try it. We'll work with it. Let us see if we can do it. So I'm not going to talk when I do this. When you are doing fine detail, do not hold your breath. You will shake, or it will encourage you to shake. Do not talk. You are permitted to exhale and paint, or you exhale and hold your breath at the end. Just like for shooting and a lot of other things where you're trying to get your muscles to relax so that you can hit a fine detail. So I will go temporarily quiet as I attempt to paint this. That's not terribly bad. That's pretty okay. It's a little bit, I lost a little bit, it got a little bit long. I lost a little bit of that top of the eye, but I can do with this. I can work with it because I can just line it. Go up from underneath. I'm trying to put the dot more toward the front of the eye so that it indicates the direction of the gaze. This is something that eye highlighting can do for you. It doesn't always have to be that way, especially if your model's big enough, like a bust, where you can actually see the irises and pupils. Then the highlight can actually be in a different place and it doesn't matter. On small models, though, it does tend to kind of help, especially on an animal eye where you can't see defined pupil and iris. It can help to indicate, direction of look. Direction of gaze. Until you drop your brush and have to rinse it and reload it. You can make jokes if you want to. I won't be looking at chat, so it'll be wasted. Yeah, if you've got a bust or a chibi, your highlight can be any old place because you can see the actual eye. But especially with animals where they don't generally have a white to their eye unless they're scared. Mammals anyway, many mammals. Those animals, you really can use the highlight to indicate direction as long as it's not conflicting with your actual light source. If you're doing a dramatic light source from this direction and you try to put a highlight on the front, it's not gonna really work very well for you. But I find that with animals, and if I paint I like to paint dragons kind of with a solid colored eye, kind of like gem-like. And when I do that, I like to indicate, I like to make sure the light is coming from a direction where I can use that highlight to indicate where the dragon or monster's attention is going. There, that's a little bit better. All right, I'm gonna go and doctor this one. So yeah, by putting the highlight toward the front here, I'm not compromising my light sourcing, which is pretty much straight zenithal on this point, on this one, so diffused overhead. It's evident enough by the head positioning on this rat, but I'm going to try to come in with the top here. One sec. Yeah. There we go. I'd lost the dark line at the top of the eye because I'd done a bit of a cat's eye slit there. Just kind of a dash instead of a dot. Usually when I do eyes, I come up from under because the sculpted eyelid is going to stop your brush and give you the ability to hit that pupil. But on a tiny animal like this, there really isn't much of an eyebrow or eyelid to stop it. And so you run the risk of getting that dash effect going over the top. There we go. Oh, he's so cute. I am very happy. I do want to come in with pinks and work on his paws and his tail more, but I think I want to go to blues now as far as the stream goes. I want to get more of the cloth done since we have this nice cloth down here, but we haven't touched the blues up here. And getting those done is going to give us a much better progress toward finishing this model because we're running out of things to do on him, really. There's this crazy texture that Bobby put on, which really I think we just have to kind of paint wet blend with washes, which, it'll be kind of fun. It'll be fast anyway. Little fine texture like this can be very difficult to pick up on your brush. You can dry brush it, but it is pretty lightweight. You can see it's a tiny grid. So dry brushing, it's going to be very challenging unless you're good at it. If you're good at it, you can totally do it. I tend to I don't like the way dry brushing looks, especially on a fine texture like this. So what I would do is actually to wet blend washes into it so that the wash would kind of pick up some of the texture in the shadows and midtones and then highlight the remaining. That's what I'll probably do. Otherwise, a fine texture like that, that's not really paintable per se, tends to actually annoy me on models. So if you're doing a wash over this, then it'll look cool. But all right, so let's see. Let's get our blues out. Blues, I'm very happy with Ratsy. Very happy with Ratsy. All right, let's get... I did not want to go there. Camera out of control. I'm just going to go more to a medium depth on the figure. There. We'll let him sit for a second. And our blues are right over here. We were using Templar, Ashen, Akata, and Irison. With, I think, some Ice Devil in there. I think we were using Ice Devil for the Aqua. But these guys are what we were using for our blues. So we're using a mixture of Core and Pathfinder. Because the Pathfinder line has a couple of light blue grays, as you can see, that work really well with this. So if you are inclined, you could actually throw Breon Blue, which is the shadow for the Templar Blue Triad. You could throw that here and you'd have a pentad. So, do I have that color? I don't think I've got Breon in my kit right now. We'll throw Rooted Like in for good measure to kind of illustrate what we mean. But I've been doing these a lot on the Patreon and the $5 tier. So if you've got a pentad that works together, then you can essentially use this to mid-tone shade highlight the shadow areas, this to do the mid-tone areas, and this triad to do the highlight areas, which essentially lets you shade, mid-tone, and highlight for every surface with colors that work all together. This is a very basic thing. As you get more progressed as a painter, you're gonna learn to mix your shadows to get more realistic shadows or more organic shadows, or maybe you don't even wanna use a dark blue for your shadows. But when you're starting out, if you kind of wanna learn and figure out, get a better grasp of shadows and highlights and the fact that you should have like still midtones and some shadows on surfaces that are facing up, depending on the surface, that can help. So there's definitely a progression. Just like I often say that triads are kind of training wheels. They give you, if you're not used to mixing and you're really just, you have no clue because you don't have an art background and you've never done it, then triads are there for you to make painting easier and less frustrating in the beginning. And then as you get better and as you get more familiar with everything and as you start trying to mix and you get more comfortable with it, that's where you start messing around with using different colors for your highlights and shadows and looking at what is realistic maybe, or what could be cool and really sci-fi or really fantasy to use really saturated shadows, all that fun stuff. Start maybe studying some color theory more about how shadows go cooler and all that sort of thing. But that comes with time. And so if you just want to get some paint on stuff, triads are a pretty good way to do it. Now, as you noted, the pointy tip of the hat has meant that we've had some rub off, and this is just a thing that's gonna happen. Iridesced, I always mix my own. Washes are a necessary evil for a paint line to have, in my opinion, but I like to make my own wash. I'm about to put out a new video on that too, on my YouTube, which is going to be free. I have a video up right now on how to use a wash. Really short, like 7 or 8 minutes. And then the next one for this month is going to be how to mix your own wash using Master Series. So it's actually really easy. So there's just a few things to keep in mind when you do it. That's why I'm going to do a video on it. All right, so Templar Blue is our blue. That's our base. I'm just going to rebase coat that. I didn't even thin the paint for that. I haven't added any water because I know this is prone to rub off, and adding water is going to mean less coverage. It's also going to mean less durability. Anytime you add anything to your paint, you are impacting the durability or adhesion of the paint. This includes additives. This can include sealers, in which case you may be making the durability actually a little better, but you're going to be changing it. When you add water, you increase the distance between the resin particles in the paint. And when you increase the distance between those, the links get a little weaker. Whereas when they're all clumped together, they're the strongest they're going to be. And if you throw a sealer in there that's very high acrylic, it's essentially like having the jar full of pebbles and then putting sand in it, where the sand goes down into the cracks and makes the jar even more, solid. That's what happens when you're adding maybe a medium to your paint. If it's a very fine medium, it can actually help your durability. It probably isn't going to help your coverage, but as far as adhesion goes, it'll actually make things stick a little better. All right, let me see here. Let's start grabbing our highlight colors and start getting some texture down here. As you recall, perhaps, we are doing actual texture on this. Really lightweight 28mm texture on the cloth. Really, really pretty simple, pretty fast. The biggest challenge is to get your paint right, your brush stroke right on these, to get that little bit of linear texture to suggest that there is a texture to the cloth. It's almost the same thing you're doing with fur, except here you're trying to thin it a little bit more and build it up in layers so that you can create blending as well. It's a little bit more challenging. But just for the record, gray blues are one of the easiest colors to do this on, guys. Gray blues tend to blend really well. They're really forgiving. They don't have a really high white load. They're a nice middle of the road color, and blues are hard to highlight when you get to pure blues, but when you throw that gray in, you make them a lot easier to work with. The Templar Blue Triad has long been one of my favorite paint triads, and when I painted the Templar army for Reaper's Warlord game back in the day, there was a reason I created this color. I've always liked gray blues. So we get our ashen blue going on here, and this is a traditional mid-tone highlight. They are, if you look at your grayscale on your color wheel, which remember is a very, very useful thing, if we look at them, we discover that. So what you do is you take your happy color wheel and kind of put the edge of the grayscale over the paint, and you assess what it is. So as you can see, this Templar Blue is pretty much a value 4. It's definitely not a value 5 because you can see that it's a different color. And the next one is a little too dark. You can kind of see that edge against it. So Templar Blue is very much a value 4. So then we'll look over here at our ashen. Ashen blue is actually much lighter. Probably 7. Yeah, it's 7. So if you wonder, if you're like, oh, is it really, really that? Then look at the next one over. And if you can definitely see the edge, then you know that it's this one. Sometimes it's a little bit between the two, too. Sometimes you'll have a 6, 7, something that's midway between a 6 and a 7. That happens. But in general, we've got a 7 here. So what we've got here is a 4 and 4 through 7. So actually, there could be another color in here, and that's something I say with the triads a lot. And this was why I kind of said that pentads work almost a little bit better than triads for Master Series. But usually, especially with the early Master Series triads, it can pay, if you're not used to thinning your paint very much, it can pay to do a 50-50 mix of the midtone and highlight. You're going to find that they're quite different. There's a great example of this is the purple triad, the first purple triad with Imperial Purple 9023 and Amethyst 9024. They're very different colors, but if you mix them 50-50 and use that color in between them, they work great. So I have no idea, Moonglooms. That's a Quindy question. Quindy, the mistress of all knowledge. Now, I'm not going to do a 50-50 mix here. What I'm going to do is thin instead. Because I know if I thin this ashen blue, I can get it to be a little transparent over that darker color, and that is going to enable me to make them blend much better without having to do the intermediate stages. Sorry, words. It's hard to word today. What is it with Mondays? And this is this is another thing that I brought up for you guys a lot, right? You have a couple of choices when you're working with highlighting and shading. You can either use thicker paint, but maybe mix a few more transitions. So if I didn't want to thin very much, or if I wasn't good at thinning, or I wasn't able to control my really thin paint yet, I would get more mileage out of mixing these two and using a progression of 3 and leaving it thicker. Because you can get decent blends with thicker paint if your colors are close together. Or you can use paints that are quite different, but just thin them more, thin the highlight more. And then it becomes transparent, and when you put it over this underlying color, it's going to be easier to blend it in. So you have choices as to what style you want to do. I think with wet palettes, you're more often using thicker paint, and so using more transitions makes sense. It can also give you a very painterly effect, which is one of the strengths, I think, of wet palettes, is they do allow for expressive brush strokes. And so does the well. You just have to mix your paint accordingly. But I think that the wet palette encourages it more than the well. So again, that's a style thing, and it's something that you're going to gravitate toward one or the other as you develop as a painter. Or you're going to be, one of the hybrid people who like to use both. Because they understand that each of these has strengths and weaknesses. There's definitely things the wet palette is really good at that the well isn't, and vice versa. And the reason I know that, but I still use a well 95% of the time, is that my style works better with a well. And that's where I say it's like, try both, and what you gravitate toward is what you'll end up using. I mean, David uses wet palette 99.999% of the time. I think I've seen him, maybe he'll use a well maybe if he needs to do a wash or he needs to do a real thin paint application that's consistent. That's it. Soft blue OOP. Okay, so if you want a color that's close, if you add a little white to Storm Chaser, if you have Storm Chaser Moon Glooms, that'll get you there. You can also take, if you have this color, Oxide Brown from the Kickstarter. It's going to be released this spring if you didn't get it with the Kickstarter. If you take Clear Blue and you add just a little bit of Oxide Brown, you don't want a lot or it's going to go purple. But if you add a little bit of Oxide Brown and maybe a little bit of white, you're going to get soft blue or very, very close to soft blue. Those navies were made by mixing complementary colors. And if you recall, browns are just muted oranges. So essentially, soft blue was a blue that had a bit of orange, brown, added to it. And then it also had a bit of white. I think it may have had something else in there too, but I just don't remember. Shadow Raven, what happens if that's happening to your well palette? Question whether you're using enough paint. It's pretty darn arid here right now in South Bay, but I still don't have trouble as long as I'm using at least 8 drops in my little palettes. If you have a big well palette, yeah, I could totally see how that would happen. But you could totally go to a wet. I mean, there's no harm in it. Play with it. See if it works. It is not different in terms of evaporation, but seriously, it is way different in cleaning. Plastic is terrible. The more you clean plastic, the more you're abrading the surface. As you abrade the surface, the paint essentially gets tiny little niches to dig its claws into. That's why getting paint out of a plastic palette after it's dried is insanely difficult, if it's dried at all. And so eventually your plastic palettes just degrade into giant chunks of paint over time, which always drives me nuts. I love to start with a very clean slate. This isn't even me like going to town on this palette. This is just a general scrub out, but I can get it very, very clean just by taking a green scrubby to it after the stream. If I do let stuff dry in the palette, which I actually did yesterday on accident because I was very tired, then you just put it in the sink with some hot water in it and maybe a spritz or two of cleaning solution. I've used 409, I've used Windex, I've used Method. Just let it soak for maybe 10 minutes. And you should be able to use a green scrubby pad to just get it right out of there. You should be able to scrape it out with a fingernail if it's a softer base. It does thicken over time, Sagebrush, but I find that it stays very good for about an hour. And my average working time, like as far as my chunks of time, I'm very good for about an hour and a half at a time, and then I get tired and I have to take a break. So I know that about halfway or a little bit more than halfway through my painting time, I'm probably going to have to add 1 drop of water to my wells to get them back to where I need them to be. 1 drop or 1 brush full, depending. The other thing is experience, and it's just that I can actually show you because this is happening right now. Let's see if I can tilt it. So when you see your paint, you see that? See how that edge is hard. The paint is up against the edge, and you see that this is all on the side of the palette. You can see that it's dry, right? Because you can see that only the very center here is wet. And you can see that kind of crinkly effect at the edge. It kind of looks goopy or gummy at the edge here in my real life. Whereas over here, I'm seeing, when I tilt it, I can see the bulge of fluid. It's not tacky. It's still very fluid around the edge here, even though I have a hard edge. If I mixed it up, I'd be fine. Here, it's going up the edge, so I know I still have a little bit of moisture. These are the paints that I've mixed very recently. So that's the progression right now. And because I can see this goopiness at the edge, this gumminess at the edge of my walnut, that's my visual cue that if I want that walnut to still be workable, I just need to grab a brush full of water and mix it in. And that's going to bring it back close enough to where it was before. The whites don't need any more fluid right now. If I try them and they're just a little bit thicker, this is why you kind of try. You kind of like look at it. Over time, you'll also get a feel for your paint consistency. And this is actually why I encourage new painters to try the well palette and to keep track of their paint consistencies. Because if you know, like me, I always start these days, either if I'm base coating, it's going to be a 4-to-1. It's going to be 4 drops 1. Or it's going to be, more often these days, it's a 2-to-1. I'll put 4 drops of paint in and 2 drops of water. Maybe 5 drops of paint in and 2 drops of water. So I always know that my paint consistency is either 2 to 2.5 to 1. And that gives me a very wide experience of how this paint reacts at that ratio. And then as I add drops of water, I know I tend to do it in a methodical way. So if I'm going to go from a 2-to-1, I'm going to actually add 2 drops of water and go to a 1-to-1. Then I'm going to play with that paint. And playing with that over time lets me know, okay, at 1-to-1, this is how Master Series paint acts. It'll change depending on what range you tend to use. Like if you use a lot of Vallejo, you're going to get a very good feel for that. But then when you move to Master Series, you might be kind of thrown because Master Series doesn't require as much thinning to get to those levels. So it's a little bit of A and a little bit of B. I keep an eye on it. If I'm keeping a paint open on my palette, it's probably because I do need it here and there. Even though I'm not painting rat anymore, this is also my liner color, so I do want to keep it good. And just when I look at my paints, I just kind of glanced here. When I get to a kind of a stopping point, I definitely look at it. So yeah, if you have a humidifier in your room, that works great. That works great. Yeah, I mean, it still should, I mean, things will dry a little faster, Shadow, and so it really depends on how distracted you get when you paint, and if you're going to be able to remember to thin it at like the half-hour mark. But I've never had to thin more than like once every half hour, especially not if I'm building a deep paint puddle. Most of these end up about 8 drops between paint and water, and they stay wet. I don't get nosebleeds here though, so it's not that bad. The other solution is a humidifier, or you can just start using a wet. I mean, use the wet palette and see if you like it. If it frustrates you, then try to work around it. Try to like figure out how you can change the humidity in your room. Having more plants in your room, having some water trays, things like that can help if you don't want to buy a humidifier. Yeah, that makes sense. I usually just put saran wrap over the top of my well, Lord nobody, if I need to preserve paint. I put drops of water in the wells around where I'm working, just a few drops, to add a little more humidity. Saran wrap it. It'll stay good for 2 days if I ignore it for 2 days. It doesn't do beyond that, which is one of the wet palette strengths. But the other thing, and I tried doing this with a wet, but it frustrates me because the water wicks up into the paint so much if I leave it over time. I really am I like to have my paint exactly how I want my paint. I'm kind of silly that way. Oh, got a little bit of rub off here. It's because I used a thinner paint to paint that originally. But it's also an area that sticks out. And some areas are just going to do that. They're like the top of his hat, it's always going to be prone to rub off. Just because it's a really sharp edge. Just like the corner of this book is a sharp edge. One way to deal with this is that you can selectively seal those spots. You can take maybe a brush-on sealer and just selectively put some extra coats over the areas that are prone to rub off. Yeah, that's another reason I actually don't use One Rex. But I don't know. I mean, they both have great strengths. They both have like especially if you're using thicker paint, like if you're using a paint with more body in it, like I think that the Scale 75 tube paint that I use would be brilliant on a wet palette. It's just that I am I'm so used to the well at this point, and I so love it that I just work with it in the well. But I imagine that the tube paint would be much better, much easier to work with in the wet palette. And it would keep it wet, and it wouldn't necessarily allow too much fluid up into it. The more fluid your paint is to begin with, the more issues you're going to have with water equalization, like the surface area wicking as you work. And that's why metallics don't work that great on wet palettes a lot, is because almost all metallics are part of they have a more fluid base, because you're going to be loading a bunch of that flake into it. It's going to make it thicker, but the base itself is more fluid because of that, to account for that. And that means the more fluid your base, the more water interaction is going to be coming up from that sponge. And so that's why metallics tend to seem to water down and kind of break after you've had them on the wet palette for a while. It's like osmosis. It's like equalization. So it's very interesting. But if you're using a tube paint, which is really thick and pasty, it's going to kind of resist that water coming up into it. It's not going to give it as easy a road to thin it down. It still will over time, but it would last a lot longer. All right, boy, we are talking a lot and we are not painting a lot. I'm going to start. I need to figure out what my fabric texture is going to be. It's this way, and his sleeve is held out, but it's not going to be like this. It's going to be up and down, because if his sleeve was just hanging down, we would have texture that way. So, all right, that's fine. It does go a little bit against. At this point, I have to stop and go, okay, well, this is a cross weave, so sure, if the texture grain is this way, then it should be this way. But it kind of violates my blending precepts where I go against the grain on long folds to get a better effect. So I'll try. I'll try it one way and see if I like it. Oh, I'd never use oil paint in a wet palette. Like, there's no reason to. Like, the water does nothing because it's oil paint. You should always use a dry palette for oil paint. The only exception would be the water-soluble oils. But even then, I don't know. I've never worked with that in a wet palette. I've only ever used a dry palette with my oils, even though I use the water-solubles. Okay, these are very narrow folds, so I can just bring in a highlight. Yes. It was a joke, Rex, but the problem is new painters might not know that. They might be like, you can use oil paint on a wet palette? I'm going to go across anyway. I decided, screw it. I don't like the effect of going in line on a long fold. We know that the cloth weave is probably a crosshatch anyway, and I'm just picking up the texture more on the perpendicular weave. So we'll just do that. Ugh, my sinuses are like, hey, there's something in the air out there. That should totally make you sneeze in the middle of the stream. So we're going across because when you do a vertical highlight stroke on a very long, narrow surface, you're going to see the brush stroke a lot more. If you want to blend it, and if you want to leave some texture, go across on the fold. It's going to confuse the eye a little more. It's going to encourage the eye to see that highlight as a blend. And as your light is falling, it's not necessarily going to hit those vertical weaves. It's going to hit the weave that's kind of like horizontal to it, perpendicular to it. But yeah, I try hard to encourage people to use both types of palettes here, because I know that the wet palette is very strong. I know a lot of very famous painters who use it. I sometimes feel like I'm like almost the lone bastion of the well palette. I think that Kirill has the right idea in that he uses both. He's one of the hybrids. Whenever he has to do detail or find stuff like this, he uses the well because it gives him control. But when he's blocking, when he's working initially, when he's playing with colors and throwing base coats down, he'll use the wet because it'll encourage him to be a little more loose. It surprised me how loose he was on his initial coats sometimes. At least in class. But it just means that, I mean, see, now you can see why this is rubbing off, as I'm constantly supporting my hand there. This is why paint model holders have that bar that goes over the top. If you have this habit of supporting your hand by putting your finger on the top of the mini's head, that's what that bar is for. To give you a stabilization for your brush hand without letting you rub paint off the model. Just in case you didn't know. So we're going to continue to do our little highlighty things here. Because with my earlier, I mentioned the pentad, ashen blue would be the highlight of my shadow, and that means that I'm going to go all the way down with this. Now my successive highlights are going to focus up here, and in fact I'm going to block out a lot of the Templar blue on the upper surface of this Because really, except for the very deep shadows, where the cloth is pretty much making a valley, my darkest color on top of the arm is likely going to be this highlight color. And you can do this a lot faster than I'm doing it, as I stop to explain a lot. It does slow me down. And of course we get distracted. Let's see, I've got to get, this actually brings up another excellent thing. Move the model, not your brush. Don't contort your brush hand to try to hit a recessed area or an awkward area. Move the model around and reposition it so that you can use your natural brush stroke. This is really important when you're starting out. It'll help you to build brush control, to use a consistent brush stroke. So if you want to build brush control faster, move the model, not your brush. Brush should be consistent. I usually stick within like this. And I don't ever do that. I don't ever do that. I sometimes will do a vertical stroke because I've trained myself to do one in some areas where it's useful, but that's the exception. So in general, I stay even tighter than a 90-degree arc. There we are. All right. So let's zoom in on this. I'm not leaving very much texture. There you can go. But I'm leaving a little bit. And I can blend this in a little bit better, but you can see how thinning my paint means that, remember, these colors were like 3 spaces apart on the light and dark scale, but you're not really seeing it, are you? It's blending in here on the bottom really well, actually. And then up here at the top, I've loaded it on. See with the additional layer how you get more. And this is the key. If you're thinning your paint, to remember this, you don't necessarily, if you're thinning your paint a lot and your colors are very different from each other, you don't have to stop and mix another highlight after you've done one layer. Because your paint is thin, you didn't get a full strength layer to begin with. So you can do your next layer with the same color and still get a difference, still see a difference. So as I work this becomes lighter as I build up this ashen blue. And I don't even have to like reach for my next highlight yet. I can get a transition from here to here to here, where up here it's going to be pretty much full strength ashen blue, right? Because I put like 3 coats on it. But I'm still using that textured stroke, so I'm still getting some texture on the sleeve, like we say. And then when you zoom out to a decent level, you can see that more. Now this is looking a little rough compared to this down here, and part of that is that I did a bit more refined work down here. I did this a little bit faster as we're getting right to the end of the stream at this point. But yeah, you can glaze to smooth this out. We will be working with our colors to smooth this out probably next time. So we'll do probably texture next time. We'll do the rest of the blue cloth. We'll probably work with blended washes on this textured stuff. And that'll be next time we get this model, which of course is not going to be tomorrow. So tomorrow we are going to be working on the chonk, everybody's favorite chonk, our bronze column, where we were messing around with a lot of verdigris last time, talking about verdigris distribution. I think I want to tackle this for highlighting and verdigris tomorrow, just to start really moving along on this guy. I'm getting to the point where I feel like I've done almost everything that I need to do on him, so I don't know how many more sessions we're going to have on Bronze Golem. I feel like it could get repetitive very easily, because pretty much there's a lot of verdigris, and it's going to be all the same stuff. You know, it's going to be all the same kind of content at that point. I may do this a little bit, because this shoulder is different from everything else. But yeah, he's come quite a way. He looks good. But yeah, you can use almost any green blue. This we actually used verdigreen, copper verdigris It's a color that I specifically made for copper and bronze verdigris, and that's what that color is. The darker green, you could use any darker green for it. I think this last time I was using, it wasn't Dragon, Brilliant, I think I was using Brilliant Green. But yeah, it's fun. I mean, doing oxidation is fun, but it can get a little repetitive when your model is this big. No beyond the kit. Oh noes. Yeah, so what we learned today, guys, is we learned to paint a tiny rat, and we learned a bit about layering, and we talked about a lot of paint chemistry today. Insane amounts. So if you like it, if you like me breaking down that stuff, watch the VOD, please. And we'll be back tomorrow with Bronze Column. And more verdigris. Maybe I'll use a slightly different color of green and show you guys how it really doesn't matter what you use. So, all right. Have a fantastic day, everybody. And, yep, no beyond the kit. And, yeah, thank you for the heads up, Quindy. Yes, and welcome to the people who had not showed up before. And it was nice meeting you, or re-meeting you, as the case may be. Have a good one, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow morning.